So far, you've talked to us about seeing and hearing, and now you're here drawing. What's it all about? Why?
Okay. All of us are born with, if we're completely lucky, all five senses. And to answer your question, we have to sort of pretend I'm five. I'm back in Suffolk as a little kid, and I've got some paper and I've got a thing to make some marks on paper with. And I'm walking along a stream with woodland on either side and nice water meadows, and I'm hearing a bird make a sound. And the bird I happen to be listening to is a nuthatch, and it's going. So even at five, I'm thinking, that's got a shape. And it calls again. There it is. Then I hear a bullfinch in some bushes a bit to the right, and it does. And I did that when I was five. So I was drawing sound, and there was no purpose to it except I was just responding. I wasn't thinking like, I'm going to be a famous composer or a visual artist. I was just thinking, something's happening. I want to respond to it. I want to record it. I got the paper and I got a pencil, and I did that. And I also noticed that certain birds, like a blackbird, when it's alarmed, just goes tick, 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 tick. So already I've got a repertoire of shapes, and I'm suddenly realising for the first time that sound has shapes. It's got contours. It's got an architecture, if you like. I mean, I didn't think in that sort of fancy way. I thought in a much more intuitive way. But now I look at it, there is a machine now which will reproduce scientifically sound, no matter how complicated. It's called a sonograph. And this is really what a sonograph does. So when I walk further down, this is where it gets even more interesting, and I'm walking by that stream, and I'm focusing on the stream, and I'm listening to the sound of the stream, let's say running through a narrow confined space, because there was a bit where it would go under a tunnel. And so the water squeezed into this tunnel, and it's making a sound which I could only, as I did then, draw. There it is. That represents all these skeins or interweavings of the sound of the stream moving into this confined space. But wait a minute, it also looks like it sounds. I mean, that actually looks like what I was listening to.
So do you think you're visually inspired and you can't help but draw a straight line like a stream, or so you can see it, so you're drawing it, whereas if you blocked out your eyes, would you still draw it as a long stream?
Yes. Yes, I mean, the reality I now know is that the relationship between things that we see and things that we hear is incredible. And not only that, but the relationship between things in nature, never mind whether you're a musician or not, causes things to be analogous with each other. They fuse with each other. For example, I can do it on the same sheet of paper, a pine cone from the top. It's arranged with its little elements in that order. It's a spiral, which is exactly the same as a hurricane or a cyclone, or, if I do this, a nautilus shell, a spiral. Or if I do that, and I look at a convolvulus climbing up, and I look at it from the top, there's the top of the thing, it grows up in a spiral. Now these are what I call fusion principles of things. When something fuses, it means they oughtn't to, but they do link. Actually, one thing is equal to another. So that analogousness between the sound of something and the look of something turned me on in a big, big way. And then, of course, I looked at that and I was somewhere else in the stream, and by the side of the stream, I see this tree's growing, and I look at the tree growing. It's an old willow tree, and I draw the amazing texture of the bark. Halfway up, there's a branch that's fallen off, and there's a hole there where, and then it branches out up here like this, etc., and there's the bank. But if I turn that this way, there's the stream. There's something causing a little eddy in the stream, and there's the stream spreading out. It's exactly the same thing happening all over again. Now that's fusion sensing. That's using all my senses. So then I began to realize that even if I closed my eyes and didn't listen, but I tried to sense things with another sense, like touch, I could sense feeling this object in my hand. I could sense smoothness. I could sense its geometry. I could sense that it was elongated. So when I open my eyes, I don't even need to do that anymore. I can sense that it's got smoothness, so it's got geometry, and it's got length of time. In music, we call that duration. So then I began to realize some other things started coming into my mind. I was thinking as I was doing all these drawings, some of the sounds are louder than other things. So, for example, if a fox barks only 200 meters away from me, like that, then I'm going to have to make a big mark. And it's not going to be it's going to have a slightly rough edge because the texture of the bark is kind of rough. I mean, a really rough one, like that. But if it's a long way off, if I'm hearing a pheasant cackle, it's going, did it? Now, this is where it gets really, really exciting because this represents, in musical terms, loud, and that represents something soft. But this also now represents foreground, and this represents background. Now, in music, we have this whole thing about there's something very quiet, okay? So that's like these little tiny dots. And here's something very loud. And I think I showed it in one of the previous conversations, this idea of this shape for loud and soft. There it is. This is that's quiet in the distance, and this is loud here, like that. So I then realized that these natural sound was divided into a discrete number of specific shapes or forms or structures. The most basic of which I've already drawn. And I'll illustrate this at the piano a bit later on, but I'll just show you these various stages. So we start off with that single. Interesting that me making the mark also produces that. I can do these two together, and they're completely relative to each other. If it's a loud one, then it's going to have to be a big dot. If it's a quiet one, it's going to be a little tiny dot. Now, these are all, if you can see these, each one of those are also, now I'm going to call these not dots anymore, I'm going to call them points. Because we're getting close to a Russian painter called Kandinsky, I think I might have mentioned him before, who's been very influential to me, on my work, who defined the basic structures of nature as points, lines, and planes. This bowl is full of points. But notice, all these points are of different forms. But they're all points. So you suddenly think, well, they're points with different values. If I were to change that into music, which I'll show you on the piano a bit later on, then what it produces is different qualities, different properties of points, and even different colours of points. But if I do this, how do you draw what I just did? Which, by the way, looks remarkably like what we're seeing on the paper. So there is not just sound and seeing combined, but the actual dynamics are the same. And that's what then leads me on to, okay, what comes after points? Time comes in. So the point, if you like, a point in time is minute in terms of time. After all, if I just go, that's less than a second. It's probably, I don't know, that tick is maybe 10th of a second or less, maybe 50th of a second. But if I continue the point, it becomes a line. And this line, the duration of the line, how long the line is, this point A, it starts there and it finishes at B. And the eye travels along the line. Now, what happens if I do the same start and the same finish, but I do this? Actually, that's a longer line than that one, although it's been done in the same space of time it took me to do that. If you read that with your eyes, it's going to take you longer to read that line, because the journey is more complicated, than it is to read that line. And again, I'll show you that on the piano in a little while. These were all in my head when I was a little kid. I was already processing these things. My drawings were providing me with a repertoire of form, a kaleidoscope, an encyclopedia of forms that I suddenly realised could be used musically. I mean, for example, here's something. It's going to be a bit naughty, but I'm sure you'll follow what I'm doing. If I do this, produce a sound. If I do a spot where each of these are, and I move them, it's music, kids. It's, each of those dots I've given a musical value by saying, okay, they're actually notes. That's higher than that one. That's really low down. That's very close to that one. That's got a space. I've got duration, interval, height, depth. Then, of course, I could, if we slowed that down, different weights of stones would have different dynamics. The heavier the stone, the louder the dynamic. If I drop two stones, one after the other, don't know whether your microphones will pick these up. Let's take a fairly big one. Ready? It's different. It's got a different dynamic. So, you think, why were you doing that? It was just discovering. I mean, I didn't realise it was an instinctive thing that made me think, I need to do this. I've already explained I could use a sense of touch to tell me about things that were happening. If I use this and I take my eyes away and I use my fingers to feel this, I can feel it's in lines, but that the lines consist of quanta, little breaks, and that there are several. So even with my eyes shut, I can probably, I won't get it that absolutely accurately, but, well, it's pretty accurate. There's the packet. There they are inside. So my sense of touch has informed me of something which is acoustic, because I just did it, but also visual. So there's a sense of touch, fusion sensing. Okay.
So what inspires you to not just witness it and take it all in? What inspired you to take that information and then feel like you had to put it down, record it?
It's a great question, Susie. I think you've the clue is in your question. It's the word information. I think I was curious, hungry to be informed about what was going on. Don't forget, the word informed and information have the word form inside them. Formula, formulaic, form, inform, formation. The word form is central to all those things, and I think I was intuitively, I've described myself, I don't know whether I've said this yet, as a patterner. I love patterns. Most human beings do, actually. When you walked in today, before we started this conversation, I noticed the pattern of your tunic, the top that you're wearing, which is, by the way, symmetrical. And that's something else I learned in nature, that you can have things which are opposing each other, like you could have, just put that out of the way, black, white, but in symmetrical relationships, or you could have black, white in non-symmetrical relationships, more black than there is white. Now, we can't do that right now because we need to go to the piano, but remind me to show you, because there are, as you know, on the piano, there are white notes and there are black notes. So what does it sound like if you have more white notes than black notes, or more black notes than white notes? It's fascinating. It's unbelievably interesting because you start thinking each of these individual black keys, black notes and white notes have got a value as distinctive as that one is from that one. Or that is as a circle from that as a circle. Or that as a circle. Or that, this one, as a circle. They've all got different properties. And this, look, honestly, Susie, it's childlike. It's childish. It's, the world's my oyster. Isn't it fascinating? We think the world is my oyster. It's like, you open it up and there's a pearl inside. The pearl, why do we say pearls of wisdom? I never thought about that. We've got this cliche, that's a pearl of an idea, because it's shut until you open it.
So it's like your curiosity opens the oyster and you see what's within by being curious and going deeper.
I think every human being, every person who is going to end up looking at this film, this interview, this conversation, will recognise in themselves everything I've just been talking about. Because unless, unfortunately, they can't touch or they can't see because they've been born blind or gone blind or they're deaf or can't speak. Those of us, as I say, who are lucky enough to have all of the senses, will absolutely recognise everything I've said. Those who may not have one or more of those senses, actually nature compensates. People hear better because they can't see, or they see better because they can't, etc. So there's all those facets. It's primeval, it's ancient, it's anthropological, and like all other listening and sounding creatures, I will use all my senses. Even smell, because smell has shapes. If you think about it, you've got. I'll give you an example of that diagrammatically, but it's still exactly what happens. This is a kitchen, okay, and you've got a hob with these things on it, and you've got a pot there, and that one contains meat. We'll call that M. This one's got vegetables. We'll call that vegetables. This one's for later, but I'm actually stewing some apples, so I'll call that A. Okay, first of all, time begins to take place because I'm not going to cook the vegetables before the meat's done. So I turn this one on first. So my sense of smell lets me know after a certain time, I begin to smell meat. It's already got texture, and that's the meat alone, but although if I put garlic in it, or tomato paste or whatever, it's going to layer and change the texture and structure. My goodness me, it's going to change the colour of the taste. What an outrageous idea, It certainly may change the way it looks visually. But then if this one comes on, if I put the vegetables on next, then after a while, by the way, we're going through time now, this will come on and that'll begin to go. And then what happens? They start to coalesce. So you then, with your nose, begin to realise that two things are blending. Now you can do that musically. You can have two musical ideas. Here's part one, which is that. And here's part two, which is just those two events. Now they're separate there, but what happens if I do this? Both at the same time. They coalesce, they fuse.
And create something new.
Absolutely, and predictable or not predictable, but it's just doing the same as that. If you go to a third stage and the apples are now coming on, this is already blended, so you've then got the option, this starts to fuse, you've got the whole lot, you've got 3 or 2 or 1 or any combination of them. You may start saying, wow, I can actually smell just the apples and the vegetables, I can't smell the meat. Oh, wait a minute. I can smell the meat and the apples separately, you know. So you're using your nose to sense structures, to sense change, to sense development. And you know, I've already demonstrated you can do it with touch. So there's taste, touch, hearing, seeing, smelling. They're all combined. I'd like, if we can now, to take us to the piano and try and show you, in sound terms, some of the things I've just been talking about here. Let's have a go. Okay, so here we are at the piano now, thank goodness, but back to the 5-year-old kid in Suffolk, listening to the songs of Nuthatch, for example, which has got this rising shape. We can do that. Or the bullfinch coming down. And then the sharp click of the blackbird. Remember this, the little pointed sound. There we have actually two basic forms, a rising form and a falling form. In nature, not only do we have things which go up and go down, we also have things which go up and down. So we can represent that musically. And if I do enough of them, you start to get close to my drawing that I did of a stream running through a narrow passage. You get we've done in one single little journey from Kandinsky's point to a line, same note, to a plane or a texture which is using lots and lots of different notes at the same time. So you can see that's given me the basic repertoire of how sounds happen in nature, and then I can explore the possibilities of, for example, if we take line, what if a line does that? I can read that musically by saying, okay, that point there is my thumb hitting this D here. Just follow the shape. So that's what Paul Klee, the painter, called taking a line for a walk. Here it's taking a tune for a walk. But I also realised in nature, things don't always go that smoothly. Sometimes you will have a sound which starts here, then appears here, drops down there and goes down there. And I can do it this way and have something very expressive and rather beautiful. For me, when I hear those sounds I'm making on the piano, I can see the shapes that have inspired them, and vice versa. The two processes are absolutely interlinked. And that's why, you know, I also talked about something which is very close to you, and therefore a big sound, as opposed to something which is a long way away. You can do the same thing. Or a big note, a big line, which is close, and a big line which is distant. So you see, everything about this keyboard is, to me, just like a piece of white paper, and on which the sounds that I make using the keyboard, but of course it doesn't have to be a keyboard, it could be any instruments, is simply translating or fusing with the visual process. Does that make sense?
And the black and white.
Yes. So I talked about this idea of symmetries of things. And here we get some lovely, very complicated territory, which I'll have to do in another conversation. But I talked about a symmetry between black and white, or an asymmetry between black and white, with more black and white. Here we've got black keys, and here's the white keys. There's more of the white keys than there are of black. But if I make, let's say, a chord using 3 black notes and 3 white notes, I get this. Now this is complicated because this is to do with perception. I actually perceive the symmetry in that chord. Even though it's a dissonance, I can perceive it's balanced. But if I add 2 more notes of black and only 2 notes of white, so I have 5 black notes and 2 white, listen to what happens. See, my ear tells me it's overwhelmingly black. If I separate them out, there's the white. This is the beginning of, if you like, a symmetrical and asymmetrical theory for harmony. I mean, I'm going to talk about harmony in an interview much later on, but that's giving you just a very simple example of this idea of symmetries which relate or don't relate. I could have a symmetry where I have, say, the same 3 notes down here, and I have the same 3 notes up there, but because they're so far apart, the idea of symmetry begins to disappear. In fact, the symmetry seems less as you go away from it. That no longer sounds symmetry because, in fact, what you've got is, I'll need another piece of paper for that, is it's still symmetrical, but the symmetry is now that far apart. So you've got this big question mark about, well, what do you do between that and that, or that? They're the same notes, but there's this incredible ambiguous space in between. This is why composers made a big thing of having a sound which was filling in that space. But if you just do that, that's a completely ambiguous space. And I love exploring the idea of a symmetry absolute and a symmetry which is slightly broken. Even in something as nice as just ordinary tonal music, symmetries change. That's not actually symmetrical in musical terms, because that's a major third and that's a minor third. So the number of semitones between them is not symmetrical. In fact, if I were symmetrical, you produce something rather extraordinary. A rather beautiful chord. So again, that's showing you very simply the idea between black and white. Well, I wrote a piece called The Wisdom of Eagles when I was very young, 21, which begins with 2 chords, F sharp and F major. And it goes like this. That produces the third option that Kandinsky talks about, which is we've had the points, we've had the line, now we've got the plane, which is all those textures all amalgamating together. And of course, the brilliant thing is you can take any of those out. If I do that again and I let the pedal off slowly, you'll hear something remarkable. You'll hear the filter of silence, which is beautiful. Do you hear that? Isn't it beautiful? You can see it's contracting. It's literally cutting bits out as the pedal is let off, and you get this, not silence, because it's still, bits of it are still there, but you've taken some bits away. And that's, again, a very, very visual process for me. It's also like smelling so much. Remember the things we smelt, the cooking in different, or feeling so much. There you go.